My intent is to address the subject of the largest mass theft in history and the moral imperative to re-engage the question of retroactive justice. History, we all understand, is strewn with great acts of courage and compassion. It's also punctuated by eruptions of bigotry and hate. The compass, after all, with which we strive to navigate our lives propelled Americans to wade ashore at Omaha Beach. And on the other hand, it also had a direction in the human compass that found malevolent totalitarians building crematoriums at Auschwitz and Buchenwald. And everyone in this forum understands the Holocaust stands as the greatest sin mankind ever perpetrated on itself. The Nuremberg trials may have brought symbolic justice to a few, but because the crimes were so heinous and took place on such vast scale, their brutality had obscured for half a century the degree to which the Holocaust was not just murder of genocidal dimensions, but grand larceny on a continental scale. In retrospect, one wonders why the theft issue was not fully addressed at the end of World War II and why it reemerged half a century later. And a number of factors come into play. Several stand out. At the end of World War II, there was widespread denial or inability to comprehend and come to grips with the breadth of the human accountability for crimes of such incomprehensible scope. Secondly, most of the victims and witnesses of these crimes had been murdered. Their silence was deafening at war's end. Third, there was an assessment in the capitals of Europe and in Washington that the victors had been too punitive to Germany at the end of World War I, and that post-war retribution had contributed to the conditions and perceived grievances that precipitated the rise of Hitler and the Second World War. Hence, reparations agreed to at the end of World War II took into consideration the counterproductive effects of the steep compensation the Allies insisted upon at the end of the prior war, a struggle that had come in its aftermath to be falsely trumpeted as the war to end all wars. Fourth, there was concern for Soviet expansionism and a desire for Germany, or at least the newly formed West Germany, to serve as a bulwark against the potential Soviet aggression. Realistic recognition was given to the devastation the war had wreaked on the country and its post-war split into two parts. Indeed, given the fungible nature of money, the U.S. with the Marshall Plan in effect came to compensate West Germany for a hefty part of its war settlement obligations. Fifth, renewed consideration of asset theft issues was made credible in the last decade of the 20th century by a convergence of three specific events: the reunification of Germany, the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, and the perceived end of the Cold War. I stress perceived end because Putin has made clear that he and his country have not surrendered. Like the false trumpeting about the First World War being the war to end all war, the end of the Cold War has been falsely heralded. Sixth, and finally, a new wave of historical research based on hitherto inaccessible documents pointed to complicity of private citizens and institutions in Nazi crimes. Likewise, art historians had come to record more fully the magnitude of the displacement of art during World War II, concluding that the war represented the greatest displacement of artwork ever undertaken or even considered. A new generation of art historians, in other words, presented a perspective that commanded international attention. They rightly established that academic soldiers were the new heroes of World War II. In a way, these soldiers were the monuments men, and I suspect most in this room may have seen the movie of that title. And by the way, George Clooney, of course, played an Iowan. And as maybe you don't know, George Stout was born in the same hometown as a man named John Wayne in western Iowa. And after graduating from the University of Iowa, he migrated to a small town in Massachusetts and attended Harvard, where he came to become the preeminent scientific preserver of art objects. And this led him at the Fogg Museum to have a very unique place. And because of his role of having served in World War I in the Navy briefly, it is believed that he is the one that first came up with the notion that we should form within the United States military a band of people to serve that were art experts. Intriguingly, Harvard had established, and I had never heard about this, but a committee to deal with how they can advise and help the United States during World War II, which is quite a natural thing to have done. So George Stout took his idea to this committee, who took it immediately to various learned societies, I suspect also including this one, and kind of a spread of the idea just almost immediately thickened, and one museum in New York even closed for 6 months to do nothing except assess the types of monuments that should not be bombed. And what I'm getting at is that it's very interesting what the academic community did in terms of World War II. Now, frankly, their greatest gift to World War II related to immigrants. That is, 3 Jewish immigrants went to a man named Einstein and explained to him what the Germans were doing about atomic weaponry. Einstein said he had no idea that that could happen, but he immediately understood the importance of it and that it could happen. And so they had a draft letter for Einstein to send to the President of the United States to form a effort to be what became the Manhattan Project. Now, ironically, in all of this, Einstein proposed the idea. It was taken seriously in Washington because Einstein was a major figure. The 3 immigrants, 2 of the 3 of which later won Nobels, did not feel that they had the stature to write the President of the United States. And yet a man in Washington who headed the FBI named Hoover would not clear Einstein to work on the project, even though he proposed it, which is a rather interesting say on America at that time. In any regard, I think it should be clear to everybody that the Academy plays a role. And I will tell you another Iowan by the name of James Van Allen, for whom the Van Allen build is made, was I forget the exact title, but it was in Washington, D.C. as a recently minted University of Iowa PhD, and he was asked to join a group with the United States Navy. At the end of World War II, the Secretary of the Navy issued a citation that read, "No individual is more responsible for the success of the United States Navy in World War II in the Pacific than Lieutenant Commander James Van Allen." Now, I raise this because it was Van Allen and a physics professor at Johns Hopkins named Merle Tuve who developed what's called the proximity fuse. But it was Van Allen who, after this invention, joined the Navy in order to see to it that this new fuse would be used in the Pacific because the gunners didn't like it. And he had to go ship by ship to convince them. So he became a salesman of an item that he'd helped invent. And it happened that salesmanship led to the largest and greatest victory in naval history in the world, where at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, we shot down almost 1,000 Japanese planes, destroyed 4 aircraft carriers and a dozen or so carriers. Now, I raise this because this is the Academy. And I am here to say the Academy ought to be patting its back for the wonderful things that it did. Now, coming back to art, what George Clooney was trying to portray was this man who had made the idea and then was asked to lead the program after making the idea. So these 2 Iowans, I hope you realize, saved America, okay? Other than that, no big deal. As for the Congress, half a century after World War II ended, I was designated by my political party to be chairman of something called the Banking Committee. And I'm sitting down thinking to myself, well, my principal responsibility is to come up with an agenda. And by chance, at that very week that I'm thinking about what is my agenda going to be for this committee, I read a very small article in the middle of the Washington Post referencing, in the title, in the heading of it was the word Swiss banks, but it was about Swiss banks had not lived up to their promises. And it was trivial. It was a one-day story. But it intrigued me. And because of the word bank, and I was in the banking committee, I said, well, let's probe this. And so as a committee chairman, we organized 4 years of hearings about Holocaust assets. Now, what the banks got in trouble for in Switzerland, and it's a really traumatic story. The reason they had developed secret bank accounts was to cater to Jewish citizens in Central and Eastern Europe. And if you're subject to pogroms, how do you keep your money safe? And these were perfect vehicles. Well, it ended up after the war, they became perfect vehicles to not, if you're a bank, not to come up with the funds that had been deposited for the family. In fact, they had rather scrupulous rules, one of which was that, or unscrupulous rules, one of which was that a member of the family had to come with a death certificate. Well, they weren't given it at Auschwitz, and they weren't given in the small towns in much of Eastern Europe where probably as many people were machine gunned down as were gassed at these camps. In any regard, this problem demanded attention, and it came to be of interest to a very small number of people at the United States Department of State, led by a deputy secretary named Stuart Eisenstadt, and my little committee on the Hill. And we started these hearings, and they got virtually no attention in this country. But virtually every European country played them big, because we're talking about European history in a very extraordinary way. And other countries copied the hearings, and they came to have a remarkable effect. Oddly, the timing was interesting because Europe wanted to have all of this subject off the board by the year 2000. And they were willing to make very deep commitments as long as this was the end. And it ended up being a mutually good circumstance because most of the survivors of the Holocaust had passed already, and there may not be any more today. And so it allowed massive new reparations to be garnered. In fact, multi-billion dollars worth of reparations were garnered from this, from the Swiss, from the Austrians, from the Germans, and it was a rather extraordinary phenomenon. The hearings that we held were unique in a congressional setting in that we were looking at history. And as everybody knows, politics is what's contemporaneously happening yesterday or today. And so we went back 50 years and we brought in historians, philosophers, victims from 3 continents, government leaders, and then commissions were formed. Paul Volcker headed a commission to look at worldwide banking problems in that era. A former Secretary of State named Larry Eagleburger was commissioned to look at the insurance industry, where during World War II and its afterwards, family members of someone who was sent to Auschwitz could not gather their claims. They just refused to be compensated. And so new compensation came in that direction. And beyond that, a Swiss economic historian was garnered into looking at Switzerland. And that's when the Swiss kind of fought pretty hard, but also capitulated and changed and made some compensations that were appreciated, among others, by the United States ambassador to Switzerland, whose family was affected. I mean, this was a very deep look at events. Well, anyway, I would like to just end with some observations that tie in a little bit to today's times. And the first relates to the Cold War that is now warming up. And in all likelihood, will soon become hotter than the public is prepared to consider. Russia and China, after all, are in a very expansionist mood. Each is preparing to bring pressure in neighboring areas. Russia, as we all know, with Ukraine, but also Belarus, the Baltic states, parts of Syria. It's possible that they will never leave the parts of Syria they've intervened in the last 2 or 3 weeks. This is a very serious set of undertakings. And China is bringing new pressure on Taiwan, some of which is quite natural. The United States, in theory, holds that Taiwan is a part of China, and so it's an awkward thing for us to deal with, and particularly awkward because China now has several thousand missiles that can carry into the waters between Taiwan and China, and therefore the 7th Fleet is no longer as invulnerable as it used to be. And so we're looking at, I think, a very short time before things could break in rapid fashion. Now, when the Cold War was at its zenith, it's very interesting that what the Monuments Men were all about were values. And what the Cold War was all about, surprisingly, we think of it as military confrontation. But the fact of the matter is, most of the world's looking at this as a battle of values. Do they prefer the United States? Do they prefer the Soviet Union? And what the Monuments Men, in their battle and their race with the Russians to capture items of value in the art world, was say, we're going to return this to the people of origin. Now, it wasn't altogether consensus in America. Some of the museums wanted some of this art. And this became quite a thing, and one of the ironies is that a group of officers, the United States Army, after this wondrous victory in World War II on the continent, wrote a manifesto objecting to the thinking of the chiefs of staff of the United States military. Now think of that. That notion means you're going to go to jail. But their manifesto was about, please recognize that you cannot bring these items back to the United States of America as if we can take them. And that was an incredibly appreciated manifesto. On the other hand, a compromise was reached, and it was decided that after a period of time, they looked at a group of great artworks and committed in writing in advance that they would tour it through America for 2 years, then it returns to Europe, which was quite a reasonable art answer. But in theory, to me, the first salvo of the Cold War was fired by one of my Iowans, George Stout. That is, the salvo is, this was the first cultural battle in the Cold War. And we won it flat out, and it was important. This is an academic who is now an American soldier hero. That's pretty nice. I mean, and something I think the academic community ought to identify with. Now, in terms of challenges, and let me understate this, we're now being attacked by a foreign state in a cyber way. And the principal objective is self-evident. The foreign state wants to increase social tension in the United States. Now, it may have a favored candidate too, but this is all of the looking at what it is they bought in cyber is designed to enhance social divisions in America. Well, national security is all about a strong military, a strong economy, but it's also about a society that's working together. And we're looking at aspects of our society that aren't. They're not at home, they're not in the middle of legislative bodies. Now, the hearings that were held in body with the State Department was total cooperation. And that was in a time that we thought was pretty feisty. We had Bill Clinton, who was impeached. We had a feisty Speaker of the House of Representatives named Newt Gingrich, both of whom were pretty bright and relatively brash. But on items like this, people could work together. And now we have the situation where you have this stolen art, and frankly, it doesn't apply to many people. That is, this may be the last major issue of the Holocaust that is newsworthy in terms of events. And yet it applies to very few people. If there were 6 million people of a singular church, singular faith, who were killed, and they had homes and businesses and rugs and furniture and pots and pans all taken away, none of which they could pass on to their survivors, and yet it's the art issue that remains. And part of it's because art is a symbol of culture, part of it is because some artworks are incredibly valuable. But I think the big part of it is that the symbol of Hitler, is it one that has a model that should be replicated, or should this be a leader that the world should understand is an egoistic villain? And for that reason, I think we have to be very careful that on Holocaust issues, there isn't a statute of limitations. Well, anyway, let me just conclude, because my ticker tells me to, but I'm going to conclude with a philosophical perspective. And this is one embodied in a presumptuous quote, and it's presumptuous because it's from a speech of mine that I gave in Tel Aviv, Switzerland, after the Prime Minister had invited me to come to Israel. A guy named Barak, his last name was the same as the first name of our head of state. Anyway, because of the hearings we held, et cetera. And here's what I told a Holocaust convocation in Tel Aviv. Mass murder makes concern for mass theft insignificant except for the motivational linkage. Because it is clear that avarice was one of the motivating factors of the hatred in man that precipitated the Holocaust, it's imperative that we continue to focus the lens of moral accountability beyond the SS troops, mass graves, gas chambers, and furnaces that previously dominated historical scrutiny, and look also into the gray, shadowy corners of the Holocaust where greed reigned. The factories, warehouses, boardrooms, bank lobbies, salons, museums, and professional offices of Axis nations, neutral countries, occupied land, and even the allied powers that eventually prevailed over the Wehrmacht. And what have we learned? In the stories of the victims and their persecutors, we have unearthed an axiom about the nature of evil. The genesis of evil may begin with perpetrators of violence and injustice, but complicity too frequently lies beyond the perpetrator in those who cloak themselves in the legitimacy of private business and genteel society while manipulating manifestly oppressive circumstances in furtherance of self-interest, oblivious to hate-driven crimes, even genocide. This lesson remains profoundly relevant for the ages. Anyway, I thank you and be happy to answer any questions you might have.
He's left everybody speechless.
Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you so much for the wonderful talk. My name is Jack Liu from Michigan. You mentioned the national security, the military, the economic. So what happened to climate or environmental security? Because people rely on those natural resources for basically everything. So
I caught everything except the last question.
or how about environment security, natural resources security?
Yeah.
Those kind of issues are essential for economic development or for other issues.
Well, how the environment changes, is that what you mean,
Yeah,
the political environment? That's going to be up to the American people. I have a view that very few people agree with my first part of my premise, then I'll give you the follow-on, that America has never had greater leadership in every facet of our life, as is symbolized by people in this room, the exception being politics. And that's a pretty big exception. But there is no reason whatsoever the American people cannot reach a consensus that we need higher quality people in public life. Now, the other conception I have that's a little different, everybody in America and across the world that's engaged in political life knows we have a separation of powers model. What very few people, especially foreigners, think about is we quadruplicated this model. So we have it at the national level, the Congress, the presidency, the Supreme Court. But you have the same thing at the state level, a governor, a state court system, the state legislature. You also have it at the county level and at the city level. And at these lower levels, things are working relatively well. In my state of Iowa, I can't tell you how well run our counties are. They're terrific. Our cities are well run. Our legislature's okay. But somehow we're into this at the national level, and part of it relates to the money in politics. Now, you ask what we can do to change. One thing in our separation of powers model, probably the great balancer that has historically been pretty terrific, has made a huge mistake. In 2010, the Supreme Court of the United States approved something called Citizens United, which stipulates that corporations can give as much money as they want into the political process. They have to be careful about not giving it directly to a candidate, but they can give it in advocacy of a candidate. Well, that's ridiculous. And they marshal this judgment based upon the First Amendment of the Constitution, under the theory that a corporation is an individual and money is speech. But if any of you were in the English department, you can't find definitions that fit that in a dictionary. And the court has made a power decision, not a rights decision in this regard. And I think it has to be changed. And if it can't be changed, the public should rise up and press a 28th Amendment to the Constitution that would bring Citizens United down. And by the way, there are movements to do this.
Thank you so much.